Hello, everybody. Ooh, 1 second. I forgot to do something. I am so sorry about that. Oh, Lord. How are you? Happy holidays. I hope everyone is in good health and good spirits. Yeah. If you're going through something right now, I just need you to understand that life just happens in cycles. You might be having some bad times right now, but they do get better. The good times are soon to come. And you'll be in a good time spell for a while, and then you'll have another challenge. And that challenge shall pass too. Just goes round and round. So just make it through. You can make it. I promise you, you will. You can make it. And if you're having some serious issues and you need somebody to talk to, email me at madamwithbass7 at gmail.com. I promise you, whatever we discuss will be confidential. I'm just making myself available to assist anybody who might need to talk out some things. Because, it is the holidays and people tend to get depressed. And if I can help somebody make it through, that's what I want to do. All right. So, my little 50 uh um my little 50 loyal subscribers, around the holidays I like to drink eggnog and rum, and that is precisely what I had about 30 minutes ago. So I'm feeling quite nice. And bigger than all of that, um as for me and my life, I have resigned from a position which has freed up some time for me. And I'm just trying to organize my life where I can be consistent and dedicate some reading time. So we are at chapter 6, and I do believe we're going to go through a couple of chapters tonight. So, Up from Slavery by Booker T. Washington, chapter 6. The title is Black Race and Red Race. I wonder what this is about. Red race, would that happen to be the Indians? We shall see. Let's go. Tell you, Indians should have never let them white folks set foot on this land. Anyway, during the year that I spent in Washington, and for some little time before this, there had been considerable agitation in the state of West Virginia over the question of moving the capital of the state from Wheeling to some other central point. As a result of this, the legislature designated 3 cities to be voted upon by the citizens of the state as the permanent seat of government. Among these cities was Charleston, only 5 miles from Malden, my home, and at the close of my school year in Washington, I was very pleasantly surprised to receive from a committee of white people in Charleston an invitation to canvass the state in the interests of that city. This invitation I accepted and spent nearly 3 months in speaking in various parts of the state. Charleston was successful in winning the prize and is now the permanent seat of government. Oh, that's interesting to know. Who knew that Charleston was the permanent seat of government way back when? The reputation that I made as a speaker during this campaign induced a number of persons to make an earnest effort to get me to enter political life, but I refused, still believing that I could find other service which would prove of more permanent value to my race. Even then, I had a strong feeling that what our people most needed was to get a foundation in education, industry, and property. And for this, I felt that they could better afford to strive than for political preferment. As for my individual self, it appeared to me to be reasonably certain that I could succeed in political life, but I had a feeling that it would be a rather selfish kind of success. Individual success at the cost of failing to do my duty in assisting in laying a foundation for the masses. At this period in the progress of our race, a very large proportion of the young men who went to school or to college did so with the express determination to prepare themselves to be great lawyers or congressmen, and many of the women planned to become music teachers. But I had my life, that there was need for something to be done to prepare the way for successful lawyers, congressmen, and music teachers. I felt that the conditions were a good deal like those of an old colored man during the days of slavery who wanted to learn how to play on the guitar. In his desire to take guitar lessons, he applied to one of his young masters to teach him, but the young man, not having much faith in the ability of the slave to master the guitar at his age, sought to discourage him by telling him, "Uncle Jake, I will give you guitar lessons, but, Jake, I will have to charge you $3 for the first lesson, $2 for the second lesson, and $1 for the third lesson. But I will charge you only 25 cents for the last lesson." Uncle Jake answered, "All right, boss, I hires you on them terms. But, boss, I want you to be sure and give me that last lesson first." Soon after my work in connection with the removal of the Capitol was finished, I received an invitation which gave me great joy and which at the same time was a very pleasant surprise. This was the letter from General Armstrong inviting me to return to Hampton at the next commencement to deliver what was called the postgraduate address. This was an honor which I had not dreamed of receiving. With much care, I prepared the best address that I was capable of. I chose for my subject, "The Force That Wins." As I returned to Hampton for the purpose of delivering this address, I went over much of the same ground, now, however, covered entirely by railroad that I had traversed nearly 6 years before, when I first sought entrance into Hampton Institute as a student. Now I was able to ride the whole distance in the train. I was constantly contrasting this with my first journey to Hampton. I think I may say, without seeming egotism, that it is seldom that 5 years have wrought such a change in the life and aspirations of an individual. At Hampton, I received a warm welcome from teachers and students. I found that during my absence from Hampton, the Institute each year had been getting closer to the real needs and conditions of our people, that the industrial teaching as well as the academic department had greatly improved. The plan of the school was not modeled after that of any other institution then in existence, but every improvement was made under the magnificent leadership of General Armstrong, solely with the view of meeting and helping the needs of our people as they presented themselves at the time. Too often, it seems to me, in missionary and educational work among undeveloped races, people yield to the temptation of doing that which was done 100 years before, or is being done in other communities 1,000 miles away. The temptation often is to run each individual through a certain educational mold, regardless of the condition of the subject or the end to be accomplished. This was not so at Hampton Institute. Hello, Grayson. The address which I delivered on commencement day seems to have placed everyone, and many kind and encouraging words were spoken to me regarding it. The address which I delivered on commencement day seems to have pleased everyone, and many kind and encouraging words were spoken to me regarding it. Soon after my return to my home in West Virginia, where I had planned to continue teaching, I was again surprised to receive a letter from General Armstrong asking me to return to Hampton, partly as a teacher and partly to pursue some supplementary studies. This was in the summer of 1879. Soon after I began my first teaching in West Virginia, I had picked out 4 of the brightest and most promising of my pupils, in addition to my 2 brothers, to whom I have already referred, and had given them special attention with the view of having them go to Hampton. They had gone there, and in each case the teachers had found them so well prepared that they entered advanced classes. This fact, it seems, led to my being called back to Hampton as a teacher. One of the young men that I sent to Hampton in this way is now Dr. Samuel E. Courtney, a successful physician in Boston and a member of the school board of that city. About this time, the experiment was being tried for the first time by General Armstrong of educating Indians at Hampton. Few people then had any confidence in the ability of the Indians to receive education and to profit by it. General Armstrong was anxious to try the experiment systematically on a large scale. He secured from the reservations in the western states over 100 wild and, for the most part, perfectly ignorant Indians, the greater proportion of whom were young men. The special work which the general desired me to do was to be a sort of house father to the Indian young men. That is, I was to live in the building with them and have the charge of their discipline, clothing, rooms, and so on. This was a very tempting offer, but I had become so much absorbed in my work in West Virginia that I dreaded to give it up. However, I tore myself away from it. I did not know how to refuse to perform any service that General Armstrong desired of me. On going to Hampton, I took up my residence in a building with about 75 Indian youths. I was the only person in the building who was not a member of their race. At first, I had a good deal of doubt about my ability to succeed. I knew that the average Indian felt himself above the white man, and of course, he felt himself far above the Negro, largely on account of the fact of the Negro having submitted to slavery, a thing which the Indian would never do. The Indians in the Indian Territory owned a large number of slaves during the days of slavery. Aside from this, there was a general feeling that the attempt to educate and civilize the red men at Hampton would be a failure. So who knew that Indians owned slaves? All this made me proceed very cautiously, for I felt keenly the great responsibility. But I was determined to succeed. It was not long before I had the complete confidence of the Indians. And not only this, but I think I am safe in saying that I had their love and respect. I found that they were about like any other human being, that they responded to kind treatment and resented ill treatment. They were continually planning to do something that would add to my happiness and comfort. The things that they disliked most, I think, were to have their long hair cut, to give up wearing their blankets, and to cease smoking. But no white American ever thinks that any other race is wholly civilized until he wears the white man's clothes, eats the white man's food, speaks the white man's language, and professes the white man's religion. When the difficulty of learning the English language was subtracted, I found that in the matter of learning trades and in mastering academic studies, there was little difference between the colored and Indian students. It was a constant delight to me to note the interest in which the colored students took in trying to help the Indians in every way possible. There were a few of the colored students who felt that the Indians ought not to be admitted to Hampton, but these were in the minority. Whenever they were asked to do so, the Negro students gladly took the Indians as roommates in order that they might teach them to speak English and to acquire civilized habits. I have often wondered if there was a white institution in this country whose students would have welcomed the incoming of more than 100 companions of another race in the cordial way that these black students at Hampton welcomed the red ones. How often I have wanted to say to white students that they lift themselves up in proportion as they help to lift others, and the more unfortunate the race, the lower in the scale of civilization, the more does one raise oneself by giving the assistance. This reminds me of a conversation which I once had with Honorable Frederick Douglass. At one time, Mr. Douglass was traveling in the state of Pennsylvania and was forced, on account of his color, to ride in the baggage car, in spite of the fact that he had paid the same price for his passage that the other passengers had paid. When some of the white passengers went into the baggage car to console Mr. Douglass, and one of them said to him, "I am sorry, Mr. Douglass, that you have been degraded in this manner." Mr. Douglass straightened himself up on the box upon which he was sitting and replied, "They cannot degrade Frederick Douglass. The soul that is in with me no man can degrade. I am not the one that is being degraded on account of this treatment, but those who are inflicting it upon me." In one part of our country, where the law demands the separation of the races on the railroad trains, I saw at one time a rather amusing instance which showed how difficult it sometimes is to know where the black begins and the white ends. There was a man who was well known in his community as a Negro, but who was so white that even an expert would have hard work to classify him as a black man. This man was riding in the part of the train set aside for the colored passengers. When the train conductor reached him, He showed at once that he was perplexed. If the man was a Negro, the conductor did not want to send him into the white people's coach. At the same time, if he was a white man, the conductor did not want to insult him by asking him if he was a Negro. The official looked him over carefully, examined his hair, eyes, nose, and hands, but still seemed puzzled. Finally, to solve the difficulty, he stooped over and peeped at the man's feet. When I saw the conductor examining the feet of the man in question, I said to myself, that will settle it. And so it did. For the train man promptly decided that the passenger was a Negro and let him remain where he was. I congratulated myself that my race was fortunate and not losing one of its members. I wonder what the feet had to do with it. Was the man's feet real big? That, you know that old adage, look at a man's feet. If his feet is big, that means he got a big, Was that it? Or was there something around the toenail, that was dark or something? I don't know. My experience has been that the time to test a true gentleman is to observe him when he is in contact with individuals of a race that is less fortunate than his own. This is illustrated in no better way than by observing the conduct of the old school type of Southern gentleman when he is in contact with his former slaves or their descendants. An example of what I mean is shown in a story told of George Washington, who, meeting a colored man in the road once, who politely lifted his hat, lifted his own in return. Some of his white friends who saw the incident criticized Washington for his action. In reply to their criticism, George Washington said, "Do you suppose that I am going to permit a poor, ignorant colored man to be more polite than I am?" I think I'll read that again. An example of what I mean is shown in a story told of George Washington, who, meeting a colored man in the road once, who politely lifted his hat, lifted his own in return. Some of his white friends who saw the incident criticized Washington for his actions. In reply to their criticism, George Washington said, "Do you suppose that I am going to permit a poor, ignorant colored man to be more polite than I am?" While I was in charge of the Indian boys at Hampton, I had one or two experiences which illustrate the curious workings of castes in America. One of the Indian boys was taken ill, and it became my duty to take him to Washington, deliver him over to the Secretary of the Interior, and get a receipt for him in order that he might be returned to his Western reservation. At that time, I was rather ignorant of the ways of the world. During my journey to Washington on a steamboat, when the bell rang for dinner, I was careful to wait and not enter the dining room until after the greater part of the passengers had finished their meal. Then, with my charge, I went to the dining saloon. The man in charge politely informed me that the Indian could be served, but that I could not. I never could understand how he knew just where to draw the color line, since the Indian and I were about the same complexion. The steward, however, seemed to be an expert in this matter. I had been directed by the authorities at Hampton to stop at a certain hotel in Washington with my charge. But when I went to this hotel, the clerk stated that he would be glad to receive the Indian into the house, but said that he could not accommodate me. Ain't that some bullshit? Wow. How do you go through life and it's okay for you to treat and make people feel like less than shit? And how do you go to sleep at night perfectly fine with that? I mean, their white Jesus didn't rustle them out there sleep and say, you know, that ain't right. That's why I say the white supremacist, the white nationalist Jesus is not the Jesus of the living God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Those are two different Jesuses. An illustration of something of the same feeling came under my observation afterward. I happened to find myself in a town in which so much excitement and indignation were being expressed that it seemed likely for a time that there would be a lynching. The occasion of the trouble was that a dark-skinned man had stopped at the local hotel. Investigation, however, developed the fact that this individual was a citizen of Morocco and that while traveling in this country, he spoke the English language. As soon as it was learned that he was not an American Negro, all the signs of indignation disappeared. The man who was the innocent cause of the excitement, though, found it prudent after that not to speak English. At the end of my first year with the Indians, there came another opening for me at Hampton, which, as I look back over my life now, seems to have come providentially to help to prepare me for my work at Tuskegee later. General Armstrong had found out that there was quite a number of young colored men and women who were intensely in earnest in wishing to get an education, but who were prevented from entering Hampton Institute because they were too poor to be able to pay any portion of the cost of their board or even to supply themselves with books. He conceived the idea of starting a night school in connection with the Institute, into which a limited number of most promising of these young men and women would be received on condition that they were to work for 10 hours during the day and attend school for 2 hours at night. They were to be paid something above the cost of their board for their work. The greater part of their earnings was to be reserved in the school's treasury as a fund to be drawn on to pay their board when they had become students in the day school, after they had spent 1 or 2 years in the night school. In this way, they would obtain a start in their books and knowledge of some trade or industry, in addition to the other far-reaching benefits of the institution. General Armstrong asked me to take charge of the night school, and I did so. At the beginning of the school, there were about 12 strong, earnest men and women who entered the class. During the day, the greater part of the young men worked in the school's sawmill, and the young women worked in the laundry. The work was not easy in either place, but in all my teaching, I never taught pupils who gave me such genuine satisfaction as these did. They were good students and mastered their work thoroughly. They were so much in earnest that only the ringing of the retiring bell would make them stop studying. And often they would urge me to continue the lessons after the usual hour for going to bed had come. These students showed so much earnestness, both in their hard work during the day as well as their application to the studies at night, that I gave them the name of the Plucky Class, a name which soon grew popular and spread throughout the institution. After a student had been in the night school long enough to prove what was in him, I gave him a printed certificate which read something like, "This is to certify that James Smith is a member of the Plucky Class of the Hampton Institute and is in good and regular standing." The students prized these certificates highly, and they added greatly to the popularity of the night school. Within a few weeks, this department had grown to such an extent that there were about 25 students in attendance. I have followed the course of many of these 25 men and women ever since then, and they are now holding important and useful positions in nearly every part of the South. The night school at Hampton, which started with only 12 students, now numbers between 3 and 400 and is one of the permanent and most important features of the institution. Okay, we're heading into chapter 7. The title is Early Days at Tuskegee. Wow. We're just going to pause for a couple of minutes before I go into chapter 7 and kind of process what we have heard. Give me 1 second. For me, I'm just appalled at the part where, the Indian man was regarded above the Negro. And my thing is, nobody should be regarded above anybody. I'm just glad that I didn't live in those days and times. I mean, the psychological effect and impact to me is just absolutely devastating. And me being born in 1967, I received the tail end remnants of that negative impact. At my point, when I'm 3 years old in 1970, 1971, 1972, 1973, I just remember in those years, the world was a white world to me and a lot of people. Especially in the 60s, and I can only go back as far as the 60s because I was born in 67. When you had a TV, if you had a TV, because everybody didn't have a TV in their house, But if you turned on the TV, all the shows were white. All the commercials was white people. If you turned on the radio, you heard white people music, you heard white voices. Walking down the street, if there were advertisements, posters for products or whatever, it was white people. It was a white world. We even had a white Jesus hanging up on the wall in our homes next to Martin Luther King, And I can remember, and I'm not ashamed to say, as a little girl, a little black girl, 5, 6, 7, and 8, I wished I was white. I remember I would take a shirt and I would stand in the bathroom mirror and I would tie that shirt on my head and act like it was my long, luxurious hair. because I've been using Bouncing and Behaving shampoo. And that's because everything you seen on TV, majority, was white. And being a little black girl, you saw how white people were treated than black people were treated better than black people. And if the roles were reversed, if you was a little white girl growing up in a black world, I imagine you would want to be black too. If all the black people were treated better, you'd want to be black too. You would sit there and you put Brillo on top of your head in the bathroom mirror. Talk about right on. Yeah, you would have. So, it is what it is. Y'all, I'm just taking a little break from reading, Just a couple of minutes more. But yeah. I remember being a little girl, maybe about 8 years old. I think I was in a department store. And I saw two white men arguing. Arguing, turning beet red, mad, arguing with each other. And I remember just standing there looking at them, and I was shocked. Because I didn't know that white people got mad at one another. I just thought, white people, they all loved each other and they stuck together. I thought that anger was reserved for black people. I didn't know they had such anger, or they could have anger towards one another. Don't judge me. I'm just being real and expressing my experience and my thought process at the time. All right, we headed back to chapter 7, Early Days at Tuskegee. During the time that I had charge of the Indians and the night school at Hampton, I pursued some studies myself under the direction of the instructors there. One of these instructors was the Reverend Dr. H.B. Frizzell, the present principal of the Hampton Institute, General Armstrong's successor. In May 1881, near the close of my first year in teaching the night school, in a way that I had not dared expect, the opportunity opened for me to begin my life work. One night in the chapel, after the usual chapel exercises were over, General Armstrong referred to the fact that he had received a letter from some gentleman in Alabama asking him to recommend someone to take charge of what was to be a normal school for the colored people in the little town of Tuskegee in that state. The gentleman seemed to take it for granted that no colored man suitable for the position could be secured, and they were expecting the general to recommend a white man for the place. The next day, General Armstrong sent for me to come to his office, and, much to my surprise, asked me if I thought I could fill the position in Alabama. I told him that I would be willing to try. Accordingly, he wrote to the people who had applied to him for the information that he did not know of any white man to suggest, but if they would be willing to take a colored man, he had one whom he could recommend. In this letter, he gave them my name. Several days passed before anything more was heard about the matter. Sometime afterward, one Sunday evening during the chapel exercises, a messenger came in and handed the general a telegram. At the end of the exercises, he read the telegram to the school. In substance, these were its words. Booker T. Washington will suit us. Send him at once. There was a great deal of joy expressed among the students and teachers, and I received very hearty congratulations. I began to get ready at once to go to Tuskegee. I went by the way of my old home in West Virginia, where I remained for several days, after which I proceeded to Tuskegee. I found Tuskegee to be a town of about 2,000 inhabitants, nearly one half of whom were colored. It was in what was known as the Black Belt of the South. In the country in which Tuskegee is situated, the colored people outnumbered the whites by about 3 to 1. In some of the adjoining and nearby counties, the proportion was not far from 6 colored persons to 1 white. I've often been asked to define the term black belt. So far as I can learn, the term was first used to designate a part of the country which was distinguished by the color of the soil. The part of the country possessing this thick, dark, and naturally rich soil was, of course, the part of the South where the slaves were most profitable, and consequently they were taken there in largest numbers. Later, and especially since the war, the term seemed to be used wholly in a political sense, that is, to designate the counties where the black people outnumbered the white. Before going to Tuskegee, I had expected to find there a building and all the necessary apparatus ready for me to begin teaching. To my disappointment, I found nothing of the kind. I did find, though, that which no costly building and apparatus can supply: hundreds of hungry, earnest souls who wanted to secure knowledge. Tuskegee seemed an ideal place for the school. It was in the midst of the great bulk of the Negro population and was rather secluded, being 5 miles from the main line of railroad, with which it was connected by a short line. During the days of slavery and since, the town had been a center for the education of white people. This was an added advantage for the reason that I had found the white people possessing a degree of culture and education that is not surpassed by many localities. While the colored people were ignorant, they had not, as a rule, degraded and weakened their bodies by vices such as are common to the lower class of people in large cities. In general, I found the relations between the two races pleasant. For example, the largest, and I think at the time was the only hardware store in the town, was owned and operated jointly by a colored man and a white man. This co-partnership continued until the death of the white partner. I found that about a year previous to my going to Tuskegee, some of the colored people who had heard something of the work of education being done at Hampton had applied to the state legislature through their representatives for a small appropriation to be used in starting a normal school in Tuskegee. This request the legislature had complied with to the extent of granting an annual appropriation of $2,000. I soon learned, however, that this money could be used only for the payment of the salaries of the instructors, and that there was no provision for securing land, buildings, or apparatus. The task before me did not seem a very encouraging one. Seemed much like making bricks without straw. The colored people were overjoyed and were constantly offering their service in any way in which they could be of assistance in getting the school started. My first task was to find a place in which to open the school. After looking the town over with some care, the most suitable place that could be secured seemed to be a rather dilapidated shanty near the Colored Methodist Church. Together with the church itself as a part of assembly room, both the church and the shanty were in about as bad condition as was possible. I recall that during the first months of school that I taught in this building, it was in such poor repair that whenever it rained, one of the older students would very kindly leave his lessons to hold an umbrella over me while I heard the recitations of the others. I remember also that on more than one occasion, my landlady held an umbrella over me while I ate breakfast. At the time I went to Alabama, the colored people were taking considerable interest in politics, and they were very anxious that I should become one of them politically in every respect. They seemed to have a little distrust of strangers in this regard. I recall that one man who seemed to have been designated by the others to look after my political destiny came to me on several occasions and said, with a good deal of earnestness, "We want you to be sure to vote just like we votes. We can't read the newspapers very much, but we knows how to vote. And we want you to vote just like we votes." He added, "We watches the white man and we keeps watching the white man till we finds out which way the white man's going to vote. And when we finds out which way the white man's going to vote, then we votes exactly the other way. Then we know we's right." I'm glad to add, however, that at the present time, the disposition to vote against the white man merely because he is white is largely disappearing, and the race is learning to vote from principle for what the voter considers to be for the best interest of both races. I reached Tuskegee, as I have said, early in June of 1881. The first month I spent in finding accommodations for the school and in traveling through Alabama, examining into the actual life of the people, especially in the country districts, and in getting the school advertised among the class of people that I wanted to have attended. The most of my traveling was done over the country roads with a mule and a cart, or a mule and a buggy wagon for conveyance. I ate and slept with the people in their little cabins. I saw their farms, their schools, their churches. Since, in the case of the most of these visits, there have been no notice given in advance that a stranger was expected, I had the advantage of seeing the real everyday life of the people. In the plantation districts, I found that as a rule, the whole family slept in one room, and that in addition to the immediate family, there sometimes were relatives or others not related to the family who slept in the same room. On more than one occasion, I went outside the house to get ready for bed or to wait until the family had gone to bed. They usually contrived some kind of place for me to sleep, either on the floor or in a special part of another's bed. Rarely was there any place provided in the cabin where one could bathe, even the face and hands, but usually some provision was made for this outside the house, in the yard. The common diet of the people was fat pork and cornbread. At times I have eaten in cabins where they had only cornbread and black-eyed peas cooked in plain water. These people seemed to have no other idea than to live on this fat meat and cornbread, the meat and the meal of which the bread was made having been bought at a high price at a store in town. notwithstanding the fact that the land all about the cabin homes could easily have been made to produce nearly every kind of garden vegetable that is raised anywhere in the country. Their one object seemed to be to plant nothing but cotton, and in many cases, cotton was planted up to the very door of the cabin. In these cabin homes, I often found sewing machines, which had been bought or were being bought on installments, frequently at a cost as much as $60, or showy clocks for which the occupants of the cabins had paid $12 or $14. I remember that on one occasion when I went into one of these cabins for dinner, when I sat down to the table for a meal, the four members of the family, I noticed that while there were five of us at the table, there was but one fork and for the five of us to use. Naturally, there was an awkward pause on my part. In the opposite corner of that same cabin was an organ for which the people told me they were paying $60 in monthly installments. One fork and a $60 organ. In most cases, the sewing machine was not used. The clocks were so worthless that they did not keep correct time. And if they had, in 9 cases out of 10, there would have been no one in the family who could have told the time of day, while the organ, of course, was rarely used for want of a person who could play upon it. In the case to which I have referred, where the family sat down to the table for the meal at which I was their guest, I could see plainly that this was an awkward and unusual proceeding and was done in my honor. In most cases, when the family got up in the morning, for example, the wife would put a piece of meat in a frying pan and put a lump of dough in the skillet, as they called it. The utensils would be placed on the fire, and in 10 to 15 minutes, breakfast would be ready. Frequently, the husband would take his bread and meat in his hand and start for the field, eating as he walked. The mother would sit down in a corner and eat her breakfast, perhaps from a plate and perhaps directly from the skillet or frying pan, while the children would eat their portion of the bread and meat while running about the yard. At certain seasons of the year, when meat was scarce, it was rarely that the children who were not old enough or strong enough to work in the fields would have the luxury of meat. The breakfast over, and with practically no attention given to the house, the whole family would, as a general thing, proceed to the cotton field. Every child that was large enough to carry a hoe was put to work, and the baby, for usually there were at least one baby, would be laid down at the end of the cotton row so that his mother could give it a certain amount of attention when she had finished chopping her row. The noon meal and the supper were taken in much the same way as the breakfast. All the days of the family would be spent after much the same routine, except Saturday and Sunday. On Saturday, the whole family would spend at least half a day and often a whole day in town. The idea in going to town was, I suppose, to do shopping, but all the shopping that the whole family had money for could have been attended to in 10 minutes by one person. Still, the whole family remained in town for most of the day, spending the greater part of the time in standing on the streets. The women too often sitting about somewhere smoking or dipping snuff. Sunday was usually spent in going to some big meeting. With few exceptions, I found that the crops were mortgaged in the counties where I went, and that the most of the colored farmers were in debt. The state had not been able to build schoolhouses in the country districts. And as a rule, the schools were taught in churches or in log cabins. More than once, while on my journeys, I found that there was no provision made in the house used for school purposes for heating the building during the winter. And consequently, a fire had to be built in the yard, and teacher and pupils passed in and out of the house as they got cold or warm. With few exceptions, I found the teachers in the country schools to be miserably poor in preparation for their work and poor in moral character. The schools were in session from 3 to 5 months. There were practically no apparatus in the schoolhouses, except that occasionally there was a rough blackboard. I recall that one day I went into the schoolhouse, or rather into an abandoned log cabin that was being used as a schoolhouse, and found 5 pupils who were studying a lesson from one book. 2 of these on the front seat were using the book between them. Behind these were 2 others peeping over their shoulders of the first 2, and behind the 4 was a 5th little fellow who was peeping over the shoulders of all 4. What I have said concerning the character of the schoolhouses and teachers will also apply quite accurately as a description of the church buildings and the ministers. I met some very interesting characters during my travels. As illustrating the peculiar mental processes of the country people, I remember that I had asked one colored man who was about 60 years old to tell me something of his history. He said he had been born in Virginia and sold into Alabama in 1845. I asked him how many were sold at the same time. He said, there were 5 of us, myself and brother and 3 mules. In giving all these descriptions of what I saw during my month of travel in the country around Tuskegee, I wish my readers to keep in mind the fact that there were many encouraging exceptions to the conditions which I have described. I have stated in such plain words what I saw, mainly for the reason that later I want to emphasize the encouraging changes that have taken place in the communities, not wholly by the work of Tuskegee School, but by that of other institutions as well. I'm going to read the above paragraph again. Did y'all get that? It says, I met some very interesting characters during my travels, as illustrating the peculiar mental processes of the country people. I remember that I had asked one colored man who was about 60 years old to tell me something of his history. He said he had been born in Virginia and sold into Alabama in 1845. I asked him how many were sold at the same time. He said there were 5 of us, myself and brother and 3 mules. Do you understand that this man included himself and his brother on the level as 3 mules? There were 5 of us, he said. Myself, brother, and 3 mules. 5 of us. That concludes the reading of chapter 6 and 7. My God, we've come a long way. And let's keep striving to the top. Give it all you got. Peace.